Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. Last week's podcast, we dealt with a story featuring Elkanah and his two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. This episode concluded with Hannah giving birth to Samuel. When the child was weaned, he was brought to Eli the priest to become an apprentice. This is part 2 of that story. At the beginning of 1 Samuel 2, Hannah prays. This prayer has 2 features. One has to do with God and how God rules. The other has to do with reversals also that have to do with God's activity. At first, Hannah accents God. She exalts in the Lord. Even her strength is exalted in the Lord. That's in verse 1 of chapter 2. She has no concerns about her enemies because she rejoices in God's ability to save. It is not clear whom Hannah regards as her enemies. Did she have in mind her rival wife, Peninnah, who never let her forget that she was barren? Did she have in mind her husband, who seemed tone deaf to the misery caused by her inability to conceive? Did she have in mind Eli the priest, who was unable to distinguish between a woman who was praying and a woman who had too much to drink? Or did she have other enemies in mind? In any case, her confidence in God's saving ability dissipated any concerns she had about these enemies, whoever they were. Hannah also emphasizes God's uniqueness. Only God is holy. No one compares to God. There is no rock like our God. Keep in mind that rock was a common metaphor for God. That's in verse 2. Given the nature of this God, arrogance or pride should never be expressed. After all, the Lord is a God of knowledge and a God able to weigh actions. This incomparable ability needs to be acknowledged. At this point, Hannah recites a litany of reversals that underscore what she has been saying about the Lord. In effect, Hannah's prayer declares that divine power is the reversal of conventional human power. For that reason, the bows of the powerful are broken at the same time that the feeble find strength. That's in verse 4. Those once sated by food have to beg for food, while the hungry are no longer hungry. A barren woman all of a sudden gives birth to 7 sons, while a mother of many becomes aggrieved. That's in verse 5. It is the Lord who is able to take away or give life, or cause someone to go down to Sheol, or be lifted out of Sheol. Sheol, of course, refers to the netherworld. The Lord makes someone poor or rich, or humbles or exalts people. As a matter of fact, God has the ability to raise the poor from the dust of the hash heap, at which point they sit with princes and occupy honorable seats. All these reversals are attributed to the fact that the pillars of the very earth belong to God. That's in verse 8. Toward the end of Hannah's prayer, we get a glimpse of the direction the story in 1 and 2 Samuel will take. God, of course, will protect the faithful, but the wicked will end up in darkness. Most importantly, humans will prevail with power unrelated to conventional strength. That's in verse 9. For this reason, God's enemies will be broken as God thunders from the heavens. How will this happen? The end of Hannah's prayer answers that question. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth by giving strength to his king and exalting the power of his anointed. Of course, being anointed is the word from which we get the word Messiah. The point Hannah is making is that God will exercise power not through conventional means, but via unconventional power wielded by his anointed one. Keep in mind that Hannah has been presented in this story as a prophetic figure. This was indicated in Elkanah's odd comment when Hannah refused to go back to Shiloh after Samuel's birth. Elkanah had said, "Do what you want, wait till the child is weaned, only may the Lord establish his word." That last phrase signals a prophetic context. Consequently, Hannah's prayer is not only a prophetic prayer, but a prediction of sorts. God will exercise power, but it will be ultimately unconventional power. At this point, after Hannah's prayer, Elkanah is back home in Ramah. Samuel, on the other hand, remains in Shiloh. While there, he ministers to the Lord under Eli the priest's tutelage. That's in verse 11. Then the story turns to Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Though they were priests, they were corrupt. One of the forms of their corruption involved sacrifices. When meat offerings were made, the meat was boiled. At a certain point, it was appropriate for the priest to put a fork into the meat and withdraw the contents. Whatever meat was stuck to the fork would be an appropriate payment for the priest. But Eli's sons insisted that they should thrust the fork into the meat when it was almost raw. Of course, this meant that much more of the meat could be extracted. In short, these corrupt sons ensured that most of the meat ended up on their tables rather than as a sacrifice to the Lord. Such behavior was contemptuous of the Lord's offering. That's in verses 12 through 17 of chapter 2. The narrative at this juncture goes back to Samuel. He was now wearing an ephod, a priestly vestment. But his mother added to his wardrobe by making him a little robe that she would bring to him when she came for the annual sacrifice. Curiously, that robe was a prophetic garment. Indeed, it was a robe that enabled Saul to recognize Samuel as a prophet when the medium of Endor conjured Samuel's ghost, a story that is recounted in 1 Samuel 28. During these visits, Eli would bless Elkanah and Hannah. The blessing involved praying that Elkanah and Hannah would have more children. That's in verses 18 through 20 of chapter 2. Eli's blessing was efficacious in that the Lord enabled her to give birth to 3 more sons and 2 daughters. In the meantime, Samuel grew in the Lord's presence. That's in verse 21 of chapter 2. It turns out that Eli's sons did more than bilk worshippers by taking more than a fair share of meat that was being offered to the Lord. In addition, they were sleeping with women in the sanctuary. When Eli got wind of this abominable behavior, he was by then quite old. Nevertheless, he had enough strength to confront his sons. Eli told his sons that he had heard these terrible reports of what they were doing. He did his best to explain how awful it was for a priest to engage in such reprehensible behavior. Unfortunately, Eli's sons had no interest in listening to their father. Because of this, they would soon be under ultimate divine judgment. That's in verses 22 through 25 of chapter 2. In contrast to this depressing account, detailing Hophni's and Phinehas' sins, we are told that Samuel continued to grow in stature and favor, not only with the Lord, but with people in general. That's in verse 26. Out of the blue, a prophet, here called a man of God, came to Eli. Almost certainly, he does not have good news. Sure enough, the prophet denounces Eli. He notes that Israel's God had appeared to the house of Eli's father as long ago as when Israel was in bondage in Egypt. That was when God chose this household to become priests, serving at the altar, burning incense, and wearing ephods. These priests would have benefited from the burnt offerings. Of course, this alludes to what Hophni and Phinehas had done to scam the people bringing burnt offerings. The prophet mentions precisely that egregious behavior. That's in verses 27 through 30 of chapter 2. If Eli thought that he would get off with a prophetic scolding, he was sorely disappointed. The prophet continues by announcing judgment. This priestly house could no longer count on the Lord's support. Instead, it would not be long before Eli's house was so diminished that older folk were gone. Soon the people in this priestly household will look enviously at Israel's prosperity, a prosperity that this priestly house would not enjoy. Even worse, violence is predicted. Indeed, Hophni and Phinehas will die on the same day. When that happens, Eli will realize that this prophetic word had come to pass. That's in verses 31 through 34 of chapter 2. The prophet is not finished, however. In the wake of the judgment on Eli's priestly house, God will raise up a faithful priest who will act in accordance with the divine will. God plans to make this faithful priest a sure house. As well, this priest will serve, quote unquote, my anointed forever. Before long, anyone left in Eli's house will implore the priests of the new house for a simple piece of bread. The priestly house of Eli is doomed. We will have to wait to see what replaces it and what happens next. Please go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is. If you have questions you would like me to address in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.